So here we are at page 70 of God to Man and Man to God, the Discourses of Mir Baba. I'll just segue the last paragraph last week. When the master serves others, he does so not because he is attached to the work, but to help and to set his disciples the example of selfless service. In his feeling of oneness, the master knows himself to be at once the Lord of all and the servant of all. The aspirant realizes the ideal of true service when he has before him the example of the master. But the spiritual preparation of the aspirant is never complete until he has learnt the art of rendering service with joy. Number 4, faith. One of the most important qualifications is faith, of which there are 3 kinds. 1, faith in oneself. 2, faith in the master. And 3, faith in life. Faith is so indispensable that unless it is present in some degree, life is impossible. Children have a natural faith in their elders, looking to them for protection and help. This habit of trust persists until the shock of being deceived or exploited is received. Faith is strengthened when it finds those qualities which invite and confirm it. Being worthy of faith and having faith in others are complementary. They are the conditions of the development of individual and collective life. Faith in oneself. Unqualified and implicit faith belongs to the world of ideals. In practice, it exists only rarely. Faith remains undeveloped, however, unless one has faith in oneself. A woman without faith in herself cannot develop those qualities that invite and foster it in others. The confidence that you can, under all circumstances, remain loyal to your own perception of the best is not only the foundation of a reliable character, but of cooperation with others. But unshakable faith in oneself is as rare as implicit faith in some other person. Few have developed it to the degree that ensures effective control of themselves. In most persons, faith in themselves is undone by the experience of their own frailties and failings. Self-confidence is thus in constant danger of being shattered and can be established only when a man has before him a living example of perfection. Faith in the master. Faith in the master nourishes faith in oneself and faith in life. In the teeth of setbacks and failures, handicaps and difficulties. Life as one knows it in oneself, or in most of one's fellow men, is narrow, twisted, and perverse. But life as seen in the Master is unlimited, pure, and self-contained. In the Master, a man's own ideal is realized. The Master is what his own deeper self will be. He sees in the Master the reflection of the best that is yet to be, which he will surely attain. Faith in the Master, therefore, becomes the chief motive power for realizing one's latent divinity. Meher, could you unmute and continue, please?
We'll ask somebody to read afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Vijay Balakar, would you unmute and continue?
Jai Baba, faith and critical reasoning. True faith is grounded in the deeper experience of the spirit and purified intuition. It is not to be regarded as the antithesis of critical reason, but as its guide. When critical reason is implemented by living faith, based on pure intuition, its functioning becomes creative and fruitful. Many forms of credulity cannot be removed except by the free working of the critical reason. However, critical reason can functioning becomes creative and fruitful. Many forms of credulity cannot be removed except by the free working of the critical reason. However, critical reason can clarify only those forms of faith that are not based upon pure intuition. True faith, grounded on pure intuition, is an imperative which cannot be, critical reason is implemented by living faith based on pure intuition. Its functioning becomes creative and fruitful. Many forms of credulity cannot be removed except by the free working of the critical reason. However, critical reason can clarify only those forms of faith that are not based upon pure intuition. True faith, grounded on pure intuition, is an imperative which cannot be made subject to reason, for it transcends the limits of the mind and is fundamental. And primary, this does not mean that faith at any stage need be blind in the sense that it is not to be examined by the critical intellect. True faith is a form of sight, not of blindness, and need not be afraid of the functioning of critical reason. The right of testing the master through critical reasoning has always been conceded to disciples. But if after testing and being satisfied about the perfection of the master, the disciple shows wavering, it is the result of a deficiency in his sincerity of approach and integrity of purpose. There are many instances of uncritical credulity in the claimants for spiritual wisdom, and many instances of unjustified wavering of faith despite a convincing basis in one's own experience. And just as credulity is the result of the unconscious operation of worldly wants, unjustified wavering of faith is due to the unconscious operation of unconscious of operation of desires that run contrary to the manifestation of faith. The first is the father of unwarranted belief, and the second, the father of unwarranted doubt. Cravings pervert the functioning of critical reason, and an unwavering faith, grounded in pure intuition, comes only to a mind that is free from the pressure of unsatisfied wants. True faith is therefore a matter of growth. In it increases in proportion to the success of disciple in freeing his consciousness from cravings. Faith must be distinguished from intellectual belief or opinion. When a person has a good opinion about someone, he is said to have a faith in him. But this kind of opinion does not possess the spiritual potency of living faith in the master. Beliefs and opinions exist in a superficial layer of the human psyche. They do not have integral relation with the deeper psychic forces. They remain in the mind without bringing about those radical changes in the personality which determine the attitude to the life. People hold beliefs as they wear clothes in times of emergency. They change their clothes to suit an altered situation. Living faith, creatively dynamic. Living faith has a vital relation with all the deeper forces and purposes of the psyche. It is creatively dynamic. There is not a thought but is enlivened by it. There is not a feeling but is illumined by it. There is not a purpose that is not recast by it. Living faith in the master becomes a supreme source of inspiration and unassailable self-confidence for the disciple, and expresses itself primarily through active reliance upon the master, not merely through the opinion held about him. Living faith is an active attitude of confidence in the master, expressing itself not only through trustful expectation of help, but through the spirit of self-surrender and dedication. Well, such fruitful and living faith in the Master is always born of some deep experience, which the Master imparts to the disciple. Just as the disciple tests the Master in respect of his capacity to guide him, so the Master tests the disciple in respect of his integrity of purpose. The Master is unconcerned about whether the disciple doubts him or has faith in him. What he is concerned about is whether the disciple is or is not sincere and wholehearted in his spiritual search. The Master is not interested in giving proof of his own divinity except when he feels that such proof is necessary for the spiritual benefit of one who has surrendered himself to him.
Thanks, Vijay.
Yeah, welcome.
Marian, could you unmute and continue reading, please?
Yes. Discipleship. When an aspirant becomes affiliated to a master, he is said to have become a disciple. But merely formal affiliation does not constitute discipleship. The relationship between disciple and master is utterly different from legal relations that create rights and liabilities through verbal understandings or formal agreements. Such transactions are inwardly determined by sanskaric ties and karmic laws and are not devoid of significance. But these relations are in their nature provisional and superficial, in no way comparable to the bond of discipleship that gives substance and direction to the life of the aspirant. Discipleship belongs to the basic law of the spiritual life. It is therefore of much greater significance than the relations that arise within the context of ordinary life from associations or contracts. Many of these earthly relations do not enter into the spiritual fabric of the life of the aspirant. The relation between master and disciple is primarily a relation between the lover and his divine beloved, the most important relationship into which a person can enter. Earthly love in discipleship is the love of God unconscious for God conscious. The love the aspirant has for the master is the response evoked by the love of the master. Love for the master becomes a central element in the life of the aspirant because he knows the master to be an embodiment of the infinite God. All his thoughts and aspirations are centered upon the master. All other streams of love join this great river of love and disappear in it. Majnu loved Layla. He loved her so intensely that every moment of his life he was filled with thoughts about her. He could neither eat, drink, nor sleep without thinking of her, and all he wanted was the happiness of Layla. He would gladly have seen her married to some other person had he known it would be in her interest, and he would even have died for her husband had he thought she would thereby be happy. The self-denial and sincerity of his love led him to the Master. Because he thought only of the beloved, his love was lifted from the physical and intellectual level to the spiritual. Purification through love and self-surrender. When the disciple meets his master, all he has to do is to love him. For loving the master out of the fullness of his heart, the disciple's union with him is assured. He does not worry about the quality of his love. He loves in spite of weaknesses and does not wait till he can purify his heart. The master is the source of purity, and to set one's heart on the master is the beginning of self-purification. When the disciple has wholehearted devotion to the master, he opens himself for the reception of the divine love, which the master pours upon him. His weaknesses are consumed in this divine love. But if the disciple is to be free from weaknesses and attain purity, he has to dedicate his life to the master without reservation. He must offer his weaknesses as well as his strengths, his virtues as well as his vices, his merits as well as his sins. His self-surrender must be so complete as to allow no room for a shadow of secret self-desires. Complete self-surrender and unquestioning love become possible when the disciple has faith in the master. Once God is realized, there is no question of faith, but until realization, the faith that the disciple places in the master is his guide. It is not for nothing that all religions are referred to as faiths. The story of Kalyan. The faith of the disciple must be grounded on his experience of the divinity of the master. The story of Kalyan brings out the meaning of this. Kalyan was a disciple of Swami Ramdas, who was a perfect master at the time of Shivaji. The master loves all disciples alike, but some are particularly dear to him. Swami Ramdas had many disciples, but the favorite was Kalyan. Other disciples did not understand why Kalyan should be so dear to the master. Once, Swami Ramdas made a test of the devotion of his disciples, wherein he carefully pretended to be so sick as to be on the point of death. He had placed a mango on the joint of his knee and covered it by a bandage so that it looked like a huge swelling. Swami Ramdas pointed to this swelling, said that it was a malignant tumor, and that there was no chance of his living unless someone sucked out the poison. At the same time, he made it clear that whoever sucked out the poison would die. Then he asked whether any disciple was prepared to do this. All the disciples hesitated except Kalyan, who arose immediately and began to suck from the swelling. He found that what he sucked was mango juice, not poison. To be willing to die for the beloved is true love. Such faith, love, and loyalty as that of Kalyan comes to the disciple only through the grace of the master.
Thanks, Marianne. Ernie, would you unmute, please, and continue?
The master realized through service. Undivided loyalty to the master does not introduce narrowness in the life of the disciple. To serve the master is to serve your own self and every other self. The master dwells in universal consciousness and wills universal spiritual well-being. To serve the master is to participate in his cause, which is to serve all life. While sharing the work of the master, the disciple may be required to be in touch with the world, but though moving in the world, he is in inward contact with the master as infinite being. Therefore, by sharing the work of the master, the disciple comes closer to him. Serving the master is the quickest means of realizing him. Service of the master is a joy for the disciple, even when an ordeal is involved that tries body or mind. Service offered under conditions of discomfort or inconvenience is the test of the devotion of the disciple. The more trying such service, the more welcome it is. And as he voluntarily accepts physical and mental suffering, the disciple experiences the bliss of spiritual fulfillment. Conflict. The sense of undivided loyalty to the master is made possible by right understanding of what the master is and what he stands for. If the disciple has an imperfect grasp of the status and function of the master, he is likely to set up a false antithesis between his own higher self and the master. And as a consequence, he may have in his mind an imaginary conflict between the claims of the master and other claims. But a disciple should, from the beginning, realize that the master requires only that the disciple should realize his own higher self. In fact, the master is no other than this higher self. This, however, does not mean that formal allegiance to the higher self is a substitute for allegiance to the master. The disciple cannot have a clear perception of his own higher self until he is God realized. And what comes to him as duty is a prompting of sanskaras interpolating themselves between the higher self and his field of consciousness. The master, as one with the higher self, makes no mistake about right valuation. The disciple, therefore, must test his own promptings by means of the orders given by the master, and in the event of conflict, he should re-examine his own ideas. Almost always a little reflection is sufficient to enable him to perceive the harmony between his own higher self and the requirements of the master. If, however, the disciple is unable to reconcile the two, he may be sure that he has not grasped what the master says. Under such circumstances, the master requires the disciple to follow his conscience at any cost. The master may sometimes give instructions with a view to preparing the disciple for a higher mode of life, when the disciple may find himself confronted by an apparent variance between his inclinations and the instructions received from the master. But the master does not give instructions for which the disciple has not had inward preparation. The master is supremely impersonal. His only concern is to remove the veils between the consciousness of the disciple and his higher self. So there is never any real conflict. At the end of his search, the disciple discovers the master to be none other than his higher self. In his impersonality, the master desires that the disciple should reconstitute himself in the light of the higher self. This is the meaning of discipleship. "12. The formation, function, and removal of sanskaras. 1. Their formation and function. There are two aspects of human experience, the subjective and the objective. The mental processes which contain the essential elements of experience and the objects to which they refer. The mental processes are dependent partly upon the immediate objective situation and partly upon the functioning of the accumulated sanskaras or impressions of previous experience. The human mind thus finds itself between past sanskaras and the objective world. From the psychogenetic point of view, human actions are based upon the operation of the impressions stored in the mind through previous experience. Every thought, emotion, and act is grounded in groups of impressions, which are modifications of the mind stuff of man. These impressions are deposits of previous experience and become the most important factors in determining the course of present and future experience. The mind is constantly creating and gathering them. When occupied with the physical objects of this world, such as the body and nature, the mind is, so to say, externalized and creates physical impressions. And when it is busy with its own subjective mental processes, it creates subtle and mental impressions. The question whether these impressions are sanskaras or experience comes first is like the question of whether the hen was first or the egg. Both are conditions of each other and develop simultaneously. The problem of understanding the significance of human experience, therefore, turns upon the problem of understanding the formation and function of sanskaras.
Thanks, Ernie. Meher, could you please unmute and
Yeah.
continue?
Jai Baba. Natural and non-natural sanskaras. The sanskaras are of two main types of natural and the so-called. Non-natural according to the manner in which they come into existence, the sanskaras gathered during the period of organic evolution are natural. They gather round the soul as it successfully takes up and abandons the various subhuman forms. Passing from the apparently inanimate stone or metal to the human, where there is full development of consciousness, all the sanskaras which cluster round the soul before attaining the human form are the product of natural evolution and are therefore referred to as natural sanskaras. They should be distinguished from the sanskaras cultivated by the soul. After attainment of the human form, treated under the moral freedom of consciousness with responsibility of choice between good and evil, they are therefore referred to as non-natural sanskaras. For though these post-human sanskaras are directly dependent upon the natural sanskaras, they are created under fundamentally different conditions. The difference in the length of the periods through which they have been gathered and the conditions under which they are formed is responsible for the difference in the degree of firmness with the natural and non-natural sanskaras are attached to the soul. The non-natural sanskaras are not as difficult to eradicate as the natural sanskaras, which have an ancient heritage and are more firmly rooted. The obliteration of the natural sanskaras is practically impossible unless the nephoti is the reception of the grace of a master.
So that's unless the neophyte is the recipient of the grace of a master. Please continue, Meher.
Yeah. Manifest lies arise owing to the will to be conscious in absolute. An important question is why should the manifested life as the different stages of evolution emerge out of the absolutely reality, which is infinite? The answer is the manifested life arises out of the impetus in the absolutely to become conscious of itself. The progress of manifestation of life through evolution is ultimately brought about by the will to do conscious, inherent in the infinite. In order to understand creation in terms of thought, it is necessary to imagine this will to be conscious in the absolutely prior to the act of manifestation. Though for the purpose of intellectual explanation of the creation, the impetus in the absolutely is to be regarded as a will to be conscious. To describe it as the inherent desire would be incorrect. It is better described as inexplicable, spontaneous, and sudden impulse, since all intellectual categories are necessarily inadequate. The nearest approach to understanding the mystery of creation is not through an intellectual concept, but through an analogy. A wave across the surface of the ocean produces a stir of innumerable bubbles, and impulses creates myriads of individuals out of the infinity of the one being, but the abounding absolutely or one being is the substance of individuals. Individuals are the creation of spontaneous impulse and have therefore no anticipation of their continuity of existence throughout the cyclic period until the subsiding of the internal tremor within the undifferentiated being of absolutely is a mysterious point through which comes forth the variegated creation, and the deep, which once was icy, still is astir with the life of innumerable selves who secure their separateness of a definite size and shape through self-limitation upon the surface of the ocean.
Thanks, Meher. Marvin, could you
Welcome,
unmute?
welcome.
The absolute is unaffected by the illusion of manifestation. This is mere analogy. It would be a mistake to imagine that some real change takes place in the absolute when the impulse of the involved will to be conscious brings into existence the world of manifestation. There can be no act of involution or evolution within the being of the absolute, and nothing real can be born from the absolute. The change implied in the creation of the manifested world is not an ontological change or a change in the being of the absolute reality. It is an apparent change. In one sense, the act of manifestation must be regarded as an expansion of the illimitable being of the absolute, since through that act, the infinite, which is without consciousness, seeks to attain consciousness. But since this expansion of reality is effected through its self-limitization into various forms of life, the act of manifestation might also be called the process of timeless contraction. But whether the act of manifestation is looked upon as an expansion of reality or as its timeless contraction, it is preceded by an initial urge or movement, which might, in terms of thought, be regarded as an inherent and involved desire to be conscious. The manifoldness of creation and the separateness of individuals exist only in imagination. The existence of creation, or the world of manifestation, is grounded in illusion, so that in spite of the manifestation of numberless individuals, the absolute remains the same without any real expansion or contraction, increment or decrement. But though the absolute undergoes no modification, there comes into existence its apparent differentiation into many individuals. The original illusion in the stone. The original illusion marks the beginning of the formation of sanskaras, which starts in the finite center, which becomes the first focus for the manifestation of individuality. In the physical sphere, this first focus of manifestation is represented by the tridimensional and inert stone, which has rudimentary and partial consciousness, sufficient only to illumine its own shape and form. Whatever illumination exists in the stone phase is derived from the absolute, not from the body of the stone. But consciousness is unable to enlarge its scope independently of the body of the stone, because the absolute is first identified with consciousness and through it to the stone. And as all further development of consciousness is arrested in the body of the stone, evolution of the higher forms of manifestation becomes indispensable. The development of consciousness has to proceed with the evolution of the body by which it is conditioned. Therefore, the will to be conscious, which is inherent in the absolute, seeks by divine determination a progressive evolution of the vehicles of expression. Evolution of consciousness and forms. Thus, the absolute forges for itself a new vehicle of expression in the mental form,
That's metal.
in the mental form, thank you, in which it becomes more intensified. But even at this stage, it remains rudimentary. It has to get transferred to forms of vegetation in which there is an appreciable advance in the development of consciousness through the maintenance of the vital processes of growth, decay, and reproduction. Emergence of a still more developed form of consciousness becomes possible when the absolute seeks manifestation through the instinctive life of insects, birds, and animals, which are aware of their bodies and respective surroundings, which develop a sense of self-protection and aim at establishing mastery over their environment. In the higher animals, mind or thought appears, but its working is limited by such instincts as those of self-protection and the care and preservation of the young. So even in animals, consciousness has not its full development, with the result that it is unable to serve the purpose of the absolute to attain self-illumination. Human consciousness. The absolute finally takes the human form in which self-consciousness appears. At this stage, the capacity of reasoning develops, the scope of which is unlimited. But as human consciousness is identified with the physical body, this consciousness does not serve the purpose of illuminating the nature of the absolute. However, in the human form, consciousness has the potentiality for self-realization and detachment from the body and its environment, and the will to be conscious with which evolution started becomes fructified in the masters or man gods.
Thank you, Marvin. Rosalie Margaret, could you unmute and continue?
At the top, the development
Yes, please.
of sanskaras. The absolute cannot reach self-knowledge through ordinary human consciousness, because that consciousness is enveloped in a multitude of sanskaras. As consciousness passes from the apparently inanimate state of stone or metal to vegetative life, then to the instinctive state of insects, birds, and animals, and finally to the consciousness of man, it is continually creating new sanskaras and getting enveloped in them. These natural sanskaras get added to after the human state is attained by the creation of non-natural sanskaras through human experience. Thus, the acquisition of sanskaras is unceasing during the process of evolution, as well as during the later period of human activities. This acquisition of the sanskaras may be likened to the winding up of a piece of string round a stick. The string representing the sanskaras, the stick representing the individual mind. The winding up starts from the beginning of the creation and persists through all the evolutionary stages and the human form. The wound string, I think it's the wound string, the wound string represents all the positive sanskaras, natural as well as non-natural. The winding of sanskaras. The sanskaras constantly created in human life are due to the various objects and ideas with which consciousness finds itself confronted, and the thoughts and actions that follow. These sanskaras bring about important transformations in the various states of consciousness. The impressions created by beautiful objects arouse the capacity for appreciating and enjoying beauty, so that when one hears a good piece of music or sees a beautiful landscape, there is a feeling of exaltation. When one contacts the personality of a thinker, one may enter new spheres of thought and be inspired with enthusiasm. Not only the impressions of objects or persons, but also the impressions of ideas and superstitions determine the conditions of consciousness. The power of the impressions of superstitions might be illustrated as follows. During the Mughal rule in India, a highly educated man who was skeptical about ghosts made up his mind to verify the truth of their existence from personal experience. He had been warned against visiting a certain graveyard on the darkest night of the month, for it was reported to be the habitation of a dreadful ghost who made his appearance whenever an iron nail was hammered into the ground within the limits of the graveyard. With hammer in one hand and a nail in the other, he walked into the graveyard on the darkest night of the month and chose a spot uncovered by grass to drive a nail in the ground. When he sat on the ground to hammer in the nail, an end of his black cloak got tied to the nail. He finished hammering and felt he was successful with the experiment without encountering the ghost. But as he tried to rise, he felt a strong pull towards the ground and became panic-stricken. Owing to the operation of previous impressions, he could think of nothing but the ghost, who, he thought, had secured him at last. And the shock of the thought was so great that the man died of heart failure. The power and effect of impressions can hardly be overestimated. An impression is hardened, and its inertness makes it durable. It can become so engraved upon the mind that despite a sincere desire to have it eradicated, it works itself into action directly or indirectly. The mind contains many heterogeneous sanskaras, and while seeking expression in consciousness, they often clash with each other. The clash of sanskaras is experienced in consciousness as a mental conflict. Experience is bound to be chaotic and enigmatic, full of oscillations, confusion, and tangles, until consciousness is freed from sanskaras, good and bad. Experience can become truly harmonious only when consciousness is emancipated from subjection to impressions.
Thank you, Rosalie Margaret. Mona Hinduja, could you unmute, please, and continue reading?
The three types of sanskaras give rise to three different states of consciousness. Sanskaras can be classified according to the essential differences in the nature of the spheres to which they refer, as of three kinds. First, physical sanskaras, which enable the individual to experience the physical world through the physical medium and compel it to identify itself with the physical body. Second, subtle sanskaras, which enable the individual to experience the subtle world through the subtle medium and to identify itself with the subtle body. Mental sanskaras, which enable the individual to experience the mental world through the mental medium and compel it to identify itself with the mental body. The differences between the states of individuals are due to the differences existing in the kind of sanskaras with which their consciousness is loaded. Thus, merely physically conscious individuals experience only the physical world, the subtle conscious only the subtle world, and the mental conscious only the mental world. The qualitative diversity in the experience of these three types of individuals is due to the difference in the nature of their sanskaras. The self conscious individuals are, however, different from all others because they experience the absolute through the medium of the self, whereas other individuals experience only their bodies and the corresponding worlds. And this difference is due to the fact that whereas the consciousness of others is conditioned by some kind of sanskaras, the consciousness of self conscious individuals is free from sanskaras. It is only when consciousness is unobscured and unconditioned by sanskaras that the initial will be to conscious arrives at its fruition. Sorry, fruition.
So that's the initial will to be conscious. It probably should be consciousness arrives at its fruition. Sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt, Mona.
something kind of
Yeah.
off. Yeah. And the infinity and indivisible unity of the absolute is consciously realized. The problem of deconditioning the mind through the removal of sanskaras is therefore extremely important.
Thanks, Mona. Mahu, would you unmute and continue, please?
2. The cessation of sanskaras. Human beings do not have self-illumination because their consciousness is clouded. The will to be conscious with which evolution started has succeeded in creating consciousness, but without knowledge of the one. Being the individual is impelled to use consciousness for experiencing its own nature. The existence of sanskaras keeps the individual confined to the illusion of being a finite body trying to adjust itself in the world of things and persons. Individuals are like drops in the ocean. Just as each drop is fundamentally identical with the ocean, the soul, which is individualized, is still the one being and does not really become separate. Yet the envelope of samskaras in which consciousness is covered prevents the individual from having knowledge of the self and keeps it within the domain of Maya. So that the individual should consciously realize this identity with the one being, it is necessary that consciousness should be retained and samskaras removed. The samskaras, which are contributory to the evolution of consciousness themselves, become impediments to eliminating the nature of the one being. Henceforth, the problem with which the will to be conscious is confronted is that of the release of the individual from samskaras. This is accomplished in the following way. Now, 5 ways of release from samskaras. Number 1, to cease creating new samskaras by putting an end to those unconscious activities that form them. If the formation of samskaras is compared to the winding of a string round a stick, this step amounts to the stopping of the further winding of the string. Number 2, the wearing out of old samskaras. If samskaras are withheld from expressing themselves in action and experience, they are gradually worn out. Number 3, the unwinding of past samskaras. This process consists in annulling past samskaras by mentally reversing the process which leads to their formation. Number 4, the dispersion and exhaustion of some samskaras. If the psychic energy which is locked up in samskaras is sublimated and diverted to other channels, they get dispersed and disappear. Number 5, the wiping out of samskaras. This consists in completely annihilating samskaras. In the analogy of the string, this is comparable to the cutting of the string. The wiping out of samskaras can be effected only by the grace of a perfect master. It should be noted that many methods of undoing samskaras are effective in more than one way, and the 5 ways mentioned are not meant to be sharply distinguished. They represent the different principles characterizing the psychic processes that take place while samskaras are being removed. For the sake of convenience, only those methods that preeminently illustrate the first 3 principles, like the cessation of fresh samskaras and the wearing out, as well as the unwinding of the past samskaras, are mentioned here. The methods that predominantly illustrate the last 2 principles, means the dispersion and sublimation of samskaras and the wiping out of samskaras, will be explained later. So
Thank you,
stay
Mahu.
tuned.
Thank you, Mahu. Anne Elizabeth, could you unmute, please, and continue?
Sure. Renunciation. If the mind is to be freed from the bondage of accumulating sanskaras, it is necessary that there should be an end to the creation of new ones. New sanskaras can be stopped through renunciation. Renunciation may be external or internal. External or physical renunciation consists in giving up everything to which the mind is attached, that is, home, parents, wife, children, friends, wealth, comforts, and enjoyments. Internal or mental renunciation consists in giving up all cravings, feelings of self-importance, opinions, habits, and attitudes. Though external renunciation is not necessarily accompanied by internal renunciation, it often paves the way for it. Spiritual freedom consists in internal renunciation, not in external renunciation. But external renunciation is an aid in achieving internal renunciation. The person who renounces his possessions disconnects himself with a potent source of fresh sanskaras. He thus takes an important step towards emancipating himself. But this is not all that is achieved through external renunciation. With the renouncing of everything, he also renounces his past bindings. The old sanskaras connected with his possessions get detached from his mind. And since they are withheld from expressing themselves, they get worn out. External renunciation creates a favorable atmosphere for the wearing out of sanskaras. For as instance, a man who possesses money and power is exposed to a life of indulgence and extravagance. His circumstances are favorable to temptations. Man is mostly what he becomes by being shaped by environment. Whether or not he surmounts his surroundings depends upon his strength of character. If strong, he remains free in thought and action in the midst of action and reaction with his environment. If weak, he succumbs to their influence. Even if he be strong, he is likely to be swept off his feet by the collective mode of life and thought. It is difficult to withstand the onslaught of a current of ideas and to avoid falling a prey to circumstances. One who resists circumstances is still in danger of being carried away by some wave of collective passion and caught up in modes of thought he is unable to renounce. Many persons would live a different life were they not surrounded by luxuries. The renunciation of superfluous things helps the wearing out of sanskaras and is contributory to the life of freedom and awakening of consciousness. Solitude and fasting. Two important forms of external renunciation that have special spiritual value are solitude and fasting. Withdrawal of oneself from worldly activities and occasional retirement into solitude are valuable for wearing out the sanskaras connected with the gregarious instinct. But this is not a goal in itself. Like solitude, fasting has great spiritual value. Eating is satisfaction. Fasting is denial. Fasting is physical when food is not taken, despite the craving for the enjoyment of eating. It is mental when food is not taken for its delights, but for the survival of the body. External fasting.
Not for.
I'll reread that sentence again if anybody will go up. Eating is satisfaction. Fasting is denial. Fasting is physical when food is not taken, despite the craving for the enjoyment of eating. It is mental when food is taken not for its delight, but for the survival of the body. External fasting consists in avoiding direct contact with food so as to achieve mental fasting. As food is a necessity of life, its continual denial is bound to be disastrous. Therefore, external fasting should be for a short time only. It has to be repeated until there is victory over the craving for food. By bringing into action the vital and psychic forces to withstand the craving for food, it is possible to free the mind from attachment to it. External fasting has no spiritual value when undertaken with the motive of improving the body or for the sake of self-demonstration. It should neither be used as an instrument for self-assertion, nor carried to such an extreme that the body is reduced to its limits. Self-mortification through prolonged fasting does not necessarily promote freedom from the craving for food. On the contrary, it may invite reaction to a life of extravagant indulgence. If, however, external fasting is undertaken in moderation and for spiritual purposes, it facilitates the achievement of internal fasting. And when external and internal fasting are wholehearted, they bring about the unwinding of the sanskaras connected with the craving for food.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We'll stop here today. So this is bottom of page 87.
Eugene,